So, you want to own a medieval barony. You're picturing a hilltop castle, a great hall with a fire going, tenants doffing their caps as you ride the boundary of your own land on a grey morning, breath fogging, dogs running the hedgerows ahead of you. All of it yours. Every field, every mill wheel turning, every villager owing you something. That's the picture, right? Land as far as you can see, and none of it answering to anyone but you. It isn't yours. Not the way you think. Under the tenurial system that ran England from 1066 onward, a baron didn't own land the way a modern person owns a house. He held it in fee from the king, in exchange for a fixed obligation, knight service, a set number of armed, mounted men supplied at his own expense whenever the crown called for them. Miss that obligation and the land could be seized back. Die with an heir too young to fight, and the king could seize your son along with it, run your estate for profit until the boy came of age, and then sell the right to marry him off to whoever bid highest. You didn't just owe the crown taxes. You owed it your children. Welcome to the business. By the end of this you'll know exactly how a knight's fee turned into a baron's income, why a £5 relief payment could sit next to a wardship worth 20 times that, how one heiress's marriage built an earldom from nothing, and why the wealthiest baronial houses in England kept going broke on crusading debt they never should have taken. And somewhere in the middle, we're circling back to that clause about your children, because it quietly ended more baronial lines than any battlefield did. A barony covered everything from a single knight holding one manor to a great earl running a private army, so the tiers matter. Bottom tier, the knight's fee. This was the base unit of the whole system, one manor's worth of land, assessed as sufficient to support one mounted, armored knight and his equipment. By the 12th century, a single knight's fee typically produced somewhere around £15 to £20 a year in assessed income for its holder, drawn from domain farming and tenant rents. That's not luxury. That's a working manor with a hall house, a few dozen tenant families, and an obligation to show up for 40 days of military service a year, armed and mounted, whenever the king called it in. Middle tier, a baron of moderate standing, holding perhaps 10 to 20 knights' fees scattered across several counties, the way most of England's roughly 160 to 200 baronial families did by the reign of Henry II. Total assessed income here typically ran between £200 and £400 a year. Now you're not managing one manor. You're managing a portfolio, domain land farmed directly under a bailiff, other manors let out to tenants for fixed rent, a mill or two taking a cut of every sack of grain ground on your land, and a manorial court that fined tenants for everything from trespass to brewing bad ale. Top tier, a great earl. The earldom of Gloucester under the Clare family, for instance, was assessed at somewhere in the range of £2,000 to £6,000 a year across its history, depending on the period and the heir. At this level you're not running a manor. You're running a private government, with your own courts, your own castles, your own retinue of household knights, and enough political weight that kings negotiated with you rather than commanded you. Look at the actual line items at each tier and the gap stops being abstract. A single knight's fee, one hall house, perhaps 30 tenant families, one bailiff, one obligation of 40 days mounted service a year. A working baron's honor, 10 to 20 manors, a home castle needing garrison wages, several bailiffs reporting up through a steward, a manorial court sitting monthly, and enough surplus grain and wool to justify carting it to a regional market instead of selling it at the gate. A great earldom, dozens of castles strung across 4 or 5 counties, a marshal of the household to run the retinue, a chancery of clerks to keep the accounts straight, and in a good year, enough spare cash to lend money to the crown itself, the way several of the greater earls did whenever the royal treasury ran short before a campaign. The pattern across all 3 tiers is the same. Nobody bought their way in with a lump sum the way you'd buy a ship or a shop. Land came from the king as a grant, tied permanently to service. A knight's fee grew into a barony through inheritance, marriage and royal favor, not purchase. The entry price for this business was never cash on the table. It was blood owed on a battlefield and a family tree strong enough to survive long enough to inherit. Nobody warns you about the hidden costs at any tier though. Your castle isn't a home. It's a standing capital liability. Stone fortification on the scale of a baronial caput, the head manor of an honor, could run into the hundreds of pounds to build and required ongoing maintenance that never stopped, garrison wages, masonry repair, timber replacement on the palisades. That sounds manageable until you stack the full bill in one place: a warhorse, £5 to £10. Mail armor for a single knight, another £5 or more. A sword and lance, a further £1 or £2. A squire's wages, food and lodging, ongoing every year he's in service. Multiply that by the 10 or 20 knights a mid-tier baron owed the crown in wartime, and the theoretical military obligation behind your income starts looking like the largest line item on the whole estate, not a footnote to it. Even at the smallest scale, equipping a single mounted knight, warhorse, mail, sword, lance, squire, cost the rough equivalent of several years of a knight's fees total income, all before he'd fought in a single engagement. And then there's the one already mentioned, wardship. If you die leaving a minor heir, the overlord, usually the crown itself, takes custody of both the child and the estate. He runs your lands for his own profit until your son reaches 21, strips the timber, lets the domain run down, and then sells the boy's marriage to the highest bidder, often to someone entirely outside your family, with zero input from you, because you're dead and nobody asked. Here's a fact worth repeating. Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records that in Chippenham and its hundred, land that had been worth £4 before the conquest was reassessed at nearly double that within 20 years under Norman management, largely because the new tenurial lords consolidated scattered peasant holdings into more efficient domain blocks. The barons weren't just collecting an existing income. They were actively restructuring the land itself to extract more of it. So where does the money actually come from? Think of the domain like the part of the business you run yourself, and the tenant land like the part you've franchised out. Domain land, farmed directly with hired labor and the compulsory labor service owed by unfree tenants, produced grain, wool, and livestock that the baron sold at market himself, keeping the full margin. Tenant land, let out to free and unfree tenants alike, produced a steady stream of fixed rents in cash or kind, boring, predictable, the floor income under everything else. On top of both sat feudal incidents, and this is where the real leverage lived. The mechanism is worth walking through slowly, because it's the whole business. Under the terms of Magna Carta in 1215, a baron's heir owed a fixed relief, essentially an inheritance tax, of £100 to succeed to a full barony, or £5 per knight's fee for a smaller holding. That number sounds manageable. It was meant to. But relief only applied if the heir was already an adult when his father died. If the heir was a minor, the overlord skipped the relief entirely and took the whole estate into wardship instead, collecting every shilling of its annual income, sometimes for a decade or more, before the heir ever saw a penny of his own inheritance. A £5 relief on a single knight's fee sitting next to a wardship on that same fee worth £15 to £20 a year for potentially 10 or 15 years is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a modest tax bill and losing the entire income of your inheritance for the length of your own childhood. That relief number is worth holding on to, because it reappears. Recalculated against a full barony, £100 flat, a fixed one-time cost written into Magna Carta specifically because King John had been charging reliefs of whatever amount he felt like, sometimes thousands of pounds, to squeeze money out of heirs who had no leverage to refuse. Recalculated again against the marriage market, an unmarried female heir's wardship could be sold for a lump sum far exceeding any relief, because whoever bought the marriage right didn't just get a fee, they got an entire inheritance transferred into their own family through a single wedding. The same £5 per fee relief that looked like a manageable tax bill for an adult heir becomes, for a child heir, the opening line in an auction where the crown sells your family's entire future to a stranger. Relief and wardship weren't the only incidents on the books, either. The crown could also demand a feudal aid, a direct levy on every tenant-in-chief, traditionally justified by one of three occasions only: to knight the king's eldest son, to marry off his eldest daughter, or to ransom the king's own person if he was captured abroad. The way Richard I was in 1192 and England paid a ransom equivalent to roughly 2 or 3 years of the crown's entire ordinary revenue to get him back. And if a baronial line failed entirely, no heir at all, the land is cheat, reverting fully to the crown with no payment owed to anyone, because there was, by definition, no family left to negotiate with. Between relief, wardship, marriage, aid and escheat, the crown had 5 separate levers to pull on the exact same piece of land, and a baron's family had no real say over which one got pulled, only over how well they'd managed the estate before it happened. Break the income into its real streams. Domain farming and tenant rents were the floor, steady, boring, the recurring base everything else got stacked on top of. Wool was the multiplier for baronial estates with sheep-heavy domain land in the Welsh Marches, the Cotswolds and the North. English wool exports to Flemish and Italian cloth manufacturers made it the country's single largest export commodity through the 13th and 14th centuries, and a baron with several thousand sheep on his domain could sell that clip directly into an international market at a margin no ordinary tenant farmer could match. Court fees and manorial jurisdiction were the luxury line, fines for trespass, fees for probate, tolls on the annual fair, all of it accruing to whoever held the franchise to run the court, essentially a private tax on every dispute in the barony. And feudal incidents, relief, wardship, marriage, aid, were the wild card, dormant most years, catastrophic or lucrative depending on which side of the transaction you sat on when a death happened at the wrong moment. That list has a pattern worth pointing out. Wool sold itself once the sheep were grazing. Tenant rent arrived whether the baron lifted a finger or not. Court fines accrued automatically every time two villagers argued over a boundary stone. The baron's actual daily labor, in cash flow terms, sat much closer to overseeing bailiffs and stewards than farming with his own hands. That's not laziness. It's the reason this model could survive a baron who was, for years at a stretch, away on crusade, at war in France, or simply incompetent, and the estate kept generating income regardless. One-sentence formula for the whole business: income equals land time service time survival. You do not own the land. You owe for it. Every mechanism in this industry, the relief, the wardship auction, the scutage payment that let you buy your way out of showing up for battle in person, exists because the crown structured the entire tenurial system around one fact: the land was never fully yours, and the price for holding it came due at the worst possible moments: death, minority, and war, precisely the moments a family has the least ability to pay. The clearest proof of that mechanism is William Marshall. He began adult life as a landless younger son of a minor baron, a household knight with no inheritance coming to him at all. In 1189, he was granted marriage to Isabel de Clare, heiress to the earldom of Pembroke and the vast Clare estates in Wales and Ireland, a marriage arranged by Henry II as a reward for loyal service. Through that single marriage, a man with functionally nothing became one of the wealthiest earls in England, holding lands across 3 kingdoms, and went on to serve as regent of England itself during the minority of Henry III. The mechanism wasn't a business plan. It was a marriage contract. One wedding transferred an entire baronial fortune from the Clare bloodline into Marshall's hands, and no relief, no wardship auction, no scutage payment came anywhere close to that kind of return. The reverse side of the same mechanism shows up in the crusading debts that broke baronial houses across the 12th and 13th centuries. Financing an earl's participation in a crusade, armor, ships, retinue, provisions for a campaign that could run 2 years or more, routinely cost several times a baron's annual income, and the money came from moneylenders, most prominently Jewish financiers such as Aaron of Lincoln, whose loan portfolio at his death in 1186 was so large the crown created a special exchequer department just to collect what he was owed from indebted baronial estates. A baron who mortgaged his manors to fund a crusade could return, if he returned at all, to find his own lands functionally owned by his creditors, or seized outright by a crown eager to collect what it was itself owed on the debt. The wardship market itself left its own paper trail. Surviving records from the royal exchequer show wardships sold for lump sums running into the hundreds, and in the case of the wealthiest heirs, thousands of pounds, paid up front by whichever courtier, financier, or rival baronial family had the cash and the crown's favor to win the bid. That's not a fee for a service rendered. That's a stranger paying the king directly for the right to run your family's land and arrange your own child's marriage, and the money never touched your family's hands at any point in the transaction. Compare that to scutage, the cash payment a knight could make instead of showing up for military service in person. By the reign of Henry II, scutage typically ran around £1 to £2 per knight's fee owed for a campaign. A baron with 20 fees could, for as little as £20 to £40, simply stay home and let the crown hire mercenaries with the proceeds instead. One set of feudal obligations could be paid off in cash for the price of a few oxen. The other, wardship, could not be paid off at all, because there was no fee schedule for buying your own child back once the crown had already sold him to someone else. If crusading debt and youthful wardship could both wreck a barony, why did some houses last for centuries while others collapsed in a generation? 3 things separated the operators who lasted from the ones who didn't. First, marriage discipline. Houses that consistently married into land, the way William Marshall did, or that married daughters out strategically to allies rather than the highest emotional bidder, compounded their holdings generation over generation. It works when a marriage brings a second honor into the family, rather than simply producing an heir. When a daughter's dowry is negotiated as a land transfer rather than a cash settlement. When a family actively petitions the crown to purchase its own heir's marriage right before a rival can, rather than waiting to see who the crown sells it to instead. Houses that skipped that last discipline in particular, that let an heiress marry beneath her status, or that produced a string of minor heirs in a row, bled wardship income to the crown repeatedly until the estate simply couldn't recover the ground. The Clare inheritance itself passed through female lines more than once across its history, and each time, whichever family successfully negotiated the marriage effectively inherited an earldom that its own bloodline had done nothing to earn. Second, domain management versus pure rent collection. The best-run baronial estates, and the monastic estate surveys of the period give us the clearest evidence of this because they were kept with unusual care, show a consistent pattern: houses that farmed a significant share of their own domain directly, selling wool and grain into export markets themselves rather than leasing every acre out for fixed rent, captured a materially higher margin than houses that simply collected rent and left the actual farming risk and reward to tenants. It works when the domain is farmed for the market rather than for subsistence. When the wool clip is sold to the export trade rather than the local fair. When the bailiff is held to an annual account rather than trusted on his word alone. Baronial houses that skipped all three of those disciplines tended to look solvent on paper for a generation, and then discovered, usually at the worst possible moment, that they weren't. Third, and this one is easy to miss because it produces no dramatic story of its own: administrative discipline. The baronial families whose estates survived longest kept detailed manorial accounts, annual audits of every bailiff's take, written customals recording exactly what each tenant owed and when, and cartularies preserving every charter and land grant the family had ever received. That sounds like paperwork rather than strategy, until a succession dispute or a wardship claim landed in a royal court decades later and the family with a better-kept muniment room won the case, while the family that had let its records go missing lost manors it had genuinely inherited fair and square, simply because it couldn't prove the claim on paper. An estate you can't document in court is an estate you don't reliably own, whatever the actual bloodline says. So, how much would you actually make if you did this right? Scenario 1. The modest path. You inherit a single knight's fee, one working manor, roughly £15 to £20 a year in assessed income. Your entry cost was effectively zero, since the land came through inheritance, not purchase. Your obligation is 40 days of mounted military service a year, or its cash equivalent in scutage, which by the 13th century typically ran around £1 to £2 per fee. Your relief, should you inherit as an adult, is a flat £5. Your income is small but essentially locked in by rent and domain farming, harvest after harvest. It's the least glamorous position in the entire system, and it's also the hardest to lose outright, because there's rarely enough here to attract a crusading debt or a court battle over an inheritance. Nobody's writing a chronicle about you, and that's exactly why your grandsons are still holding the same manor a century later, while flashier neighbors have already lost theirs. Scenario 2. The working baron. You hold 15 knights' fees across 4 counties, £250 to £300 a year in assessed income, a manorial court on your home manor, and enough wool coming off your domain sheep to sell directly into the export trade rather than the local market. Your investment was 2 generations of careful marriages and 1 relief payment your grandfather negotiated down through royal favor. Your risk is real. A minority succession here could hand the crown 10 years of your income before your own heir sees a shilling of it. A wardship auction could sell your own child's marriage to a rival family for a sum that never touches your estate, and a bad crusading debt could mortgage half your manors to a moneylender who has no interest in your family's long-term survival. Manage all 3 risks well across 2 generations, and this is the tier that quietly becomes an earldom. Manage any one of them badly, and this is the tier that quietly disappears from the record within 50 years, its manors absorbed into a neighboring honor that happened to buy the wardship. Scenario 3. The Earl. 50 or more knights' fees, several £1,000s a year, your own private army of household knights, castles that function as both fortress and regional government. And this is where the real payout stops being the rent roll. It was proximity to the crown itself. William Marshal, born a landless younger son, died in 1219 having served as Regent of England, buried with the honors of a king because he had, for 2 years, effectively run the kingdom in a child monarch's name. That's the ceiling of this industry. It was never denominated in shillings. So, do you still want to own a medieval barony? Here's the actual deal on the table. A business where the land can be taken back the moment your service lapses, where your own children can be seized and sold into marriage the day you die too soon, where a single crusading loan can hand your family's estate to a moneylender in Lincoln, and where the single largest fortune in the entire system was won not through farming or wool or rent, but through one carefully arranged wedding. You ride the boundary of your land on that grey morning, breath fogging, dogs running ahead through the hedgerows, and every field really does look like it belongs to you. It never did. You do not own the land. You owe for it. If you want to see what that looked like at the smallest scale, one manor, one knight, no army, no earldom, go watch the economics of owning a knight's manor. It's the exact same trap, just before it got expensive. Links right there.